Bay Trail. And as the tens of thousands of 49ers went west through the Pima territory, the U.S. government asked the Pima to feed them and to protect them, which they did. And in the 1870s, 1880s, the Anglos started moving into the Pima territory. They diverted the Gila River water that the Pima used to irrigate their fields. They overhunted the local mountains. And by the 1870s, 1880s, the Pima started going through what they called the years of starvation, years of famine. And by 1901, 1902, when this Harvard anthropologist Frank Russell came to live with the Pima, they were now living on their land had been turned into a reservation. They were living on government rations to survive. And now they had an obesity problem. Many old persons exhibit, this is what Russell wrote, many old persons exhibit a degree of obesity that's in striking contrast with the tall and sinewy Indian conventionalized and popular thought. So what's interesting about the Pima is they went from being extremely affluent to extremely poor, from having an abundance of food to living off government handouts to survive, the opposite of our toxic environment hypothesis, and yet they went from being sprightly and in fine health to having an obesity epidemic. This is the opposite of what our hypothesis would predict. Our hypothesis would predict that when food is in abundance, when they have the greatest abundance, that's when they're the fattest. So you could go through the literature, something the experts don't do, but I did because I thought I had time to write this book. And you could find examples of populations which had levels of obesity as high as we have in the United States today, which were poor beyond our imagination and hadn't affected no food industry, no toxic environment as we would describe it. So in 1928, two University of Chicago economists studied the South Dakota the Sioux living on the South Dakota Crow Creek Reservation. These are the living conditions. These Native Americans are living in 1 to 2 room shacks, unfit for occupancy, 4 to 8 people per room. 40% of the children on this reservation lived in homes without toilets. Water was drawn from the river. 15 families on the reservation were living chiefly on bread and coffee. And yet 40% of the women, 25% of the men, and 10% of the children were effectively obese. And interestingly enough, and this is what we're going to come back to, 20% of the women, 25% of the men, and a quarter of the children were extremely thin. This is a combination of obesity, malnutrition existing in the same population. It's something we've heard about a lot in the past 5 years. The point is there's absolutely nothing new about it, but it's going to tell us something fundamental about the way we think. So again, what I did in my book is I went back and I looked for every possible example, every place where somebody studied obesity levels in a population. And I found about a dozen pre-1980 reports. Usually it was diabetes specialists who were looking at the high rates of diabetes, and they also weighed and measured the subjects. These photos, this is a photo of women traders in a fish market in Nigeria that was taken in the early 1970s. This is an obese Nigerian child, aged 11. There's nothing new about obesity. What's new is the obesity epidemic. And these are some of the examples. African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina, 18% of the men and 30% of the women are obese. Total family incomes of $9 to $53 a week. I mean, these people are poor beyond our imagination. Zulus in Durban, South Africa, 40% of the adult women are obese, and women in their 40s average 175 pounds. Trinidad, 1961-63, there was a malnutrition crisis in Trinidad. The U.S. government sends down a team of nutritionists to help them get the island in order, and these nutritionists report that a third of the women over 25 are obese. They say obesity is, quote, a potentially serious medical problem in women, and when an MIT nutritionist goes down the next year to study the diets, she reports that the per capita daily diet is less than 2,000 calories. It's 21% fat. So she's eating not too much and not a lot of fat, and yet fewer calories than recommended by the Food and Agriculture Organization for a healthy lifestyle, and yet a third of the women are obese. Here's some more of these studies. Bantu pensioners. These are the poorest of the poor Bantu in South Africa, and the mean weight of the women over 60 is 165 pounds. Chilean factory workers, 1974, 30% are obese, 10% suffer undernourishment. So there's that combination again of obesity and malnutrition. Nearly 50% of the women over 54 are obese, and most are engaged in heavy labor. Okay, so they're not out, they don't belong to health clubs, they're not out walking or running marathons, and yet they're working in factories, and 50% of the women over 54 are obese. Here's one of my favorite studies. It's the last one I'll show you. William Mueller, a cardiologist at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, goes down to study the heart disease among Mexican Americans in Starr County, Texas, down here. This was in the early 1980s, and he reports that 50% of the women in their 50s are obese and 40% of the men in their 40s. Quote, most inhabitants are employed in agricultural labor and or work in the oil fields in the country. So again, they're not working out, they're not exercising, they're not actively trying to walk, but they're spending their entire day in heavy labor, and a kind of labor that I think few of us in this room, and certainly not I, could do. I worked for 3 weeks as a construction worker in high school, and I quit because I hated it and couldn't do it. There is one restaurant in Starr County, Texas in 1981, a Mexican restaurant. So there's no toxic environment as we would describe it today. These people are physically active. They're not being force-fed large portions of food from McDonald's and Burger Kings and Chili's, and they're probably not even watching that much television. So why are they fat? And this is a question Ralph Richards asked. He was a British-trained diabetes specialist. He moved to Kingston, Jamaica in the 1960s. He opened a diabetes clinic, reported that 10% of the men and 2/3 of the adult women are obese. And he said, it's difficult to explain the high frequency of obesity seen in a relatively impecunious society such as exists in the West Indies when compared to the standard of living enjoyed in the more developed countries. Malnutrition and subnutrition are common disorders in the first 2 years of life in these areas and account for almost 25% of all admissions to pediatric wards in Jamaica. Subnutrition continues in early childhood to the early teens. Young people are not getting enough food in these societies. And yet obesity begins to manifest itself in the female population from the 25th year of life and reaches enormous proportions from 30 onwards. And what's interesting is how open-minded that was. Because now we're going to look at the 2005 version of it. This is Benjamin Caballero, who's director of the Center for Human Nutrition at Hopkins. I mean, a good school. Writes an article called A Nutrition Paradox, Underweight and Obesity in Developing Countries. Publishes in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a decent journal. And he says, a few years ago, I was visiting a primary care clinic in the slums of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The waiting room was full of mothers with thin, stunted young children exhibiting the typical signs of chronic undernutrition. Their appearance sadly would surprise few who visit poor urban areas in the developing world. What might come as a surprise that many of the mothers holding those undernourished infants were themselves overweight. And then he says, it's a paragraph later, the coexistence of underweight and overweight poses a challenge to public health programs, since the aims of programs to reduce undernutrition, give people more food, are obviously in conflict with those for obesity prevention, get them to eat less. And the reason I put this in italics is because the coexistence of underweight and overweight poses a challenge to your paradigm, to how you think about obesity. If you think that mothers get fat because they eat too much, and yet their children are starving, then you are implying that the mothers are taking superfluous calories and that they could give to their children to keep them alive, that the mothers are allowing their children to starve to death so that they themselves can get fat. And this is the kind of anomalous observation. For instance, I started my career writing about physics. Physicists have spent $10 billion building an accelerator so that they could discover something they can't explain, that doesn't fit. Here you have a paradigm that says, if we believe obesity is caused by eating too much, then we believe mothers are willing to starve their children in order to get fat. So are we going to believe everything we know about maternal instincts, or are we going to believe what we think we know about overweight? Okay, let's look at some more inconvenient facts. It's observations that have trouble fitting with our belief in the overeating, the energy balance hypothesis. First is that calorie-restricted diets often fail. Mostly fail, usually fail. And the reason I put semi-starvation in parentheses, because these diets used to be referred to as semi-starvation diets, because what you're literally doing is semi-starving someone and expecting them to then go from being obese to normal weight. That terminology fell out of usage in the late 1970s, and my gut feeling is it did because it is obvious that you cannot semi-starve someone for an entire lifetime. So it became calorie-restricted or just diets. But I could pick any meta-analysis I wanted to. I used the Cochrane collaboration because they were a collaboration formed to do unbiased meta-analyses, and as they put, a weight loss achieved in clinical trials is so small as to be clinically insignificant. Okay, so we get fat because we eat too much, but if we try to eat less, it doesn't work. And this dichotomy is interesting because what it does is when you actually read the literature closely, you see these bizarre inconsistencies in it. I mean, from the point of view of a journalist who was naive to this field going into it, you know, you'd see things like this, a Handbook of Obesity, which was edited by George Bray, and then two of the other